Welcome back to the Institute for Black Male Studies. I am Dr. T. Hassan Johnson, and I'm honored to welcome you to an interview we're going to have with a good colleague of mine, Professor Kwadwo Addo Gyan, brilliant scholar and activist in the Bay Area of California. We're going to have him on in a moment to talk about his work. He is a visual artist, writer, and scholar of visual culture. His area of expertise is African and Afro-diasporic visual culture. As the co-founder of the Sankofa Cultural Institute, he was the creative director of 3 symposiums on jazz history and has lectured widely on the topic of jazz and visual culture at galleries, museums, universities, and colleges. The good professor was an invited speaker at San Francisco MoMA's 75th anniversary event, 75 Reasons to Live, and is an alumni columnist for the museum's open space blog. He is also co-author of Black Artists in Oakland, a visual history published by Arcadia Publishing. Most recently, he co-founded the Oakland Maroons Art Collective and is currently one of several cultural theorists working in the future of Soul think tank at the Yerba Buena Center for Arts. He holds a master's degree in visual and critical studies from the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. And if I could, I would like you to help me welcome Professor Kwadwo, as his students call him. How you doing, brother?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah. Oh man, thank you for coming in, man. It's an honor. I had a chance to see you present at the National Council for Black Studies conference a few years ago, and I regret not asking you earlier, brother. So I'm happy you were able to join me now. What well, I like. Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, with my bio, that I'm currently at San Francisco State University in the Africana Studies Department. Yeah.
There we go. There we go.
I wanted to make sure I got that in.
Beautiful. I appreciate you doing that. And as a matter of fact, a good brother of mine, I'm sure we have in common, used to teach there as well. And I'll probably bring him up to you a little bit later. But anyway, so what I usually like to do is really start at early life. Tell us where you're from and what are some of your early experiences that, really began to shape the scholar activists we see in front of us today.
Okay, so I'm born in 1960, and my father was in the Air Force. I'm the son of a mother from Bogalusa, Louisiana, and a father from New Orleans, Louisiana. And he was in the Air Force. And so basically, for the early part of my life and adolescence, we kind of bounced all across the United States and lived in Germany for a couple of years, et cetera. And I was born in Marquette, Michigan, but left there when I was like 2 years old. So I don't really know Marquette, Michigan all that well. But, some of the points on the map that I'd grown up in were the southern tip of Florida, way down where Homestead, Florida is, all the way up to the, Northern California, places like Oroville, California, and San Diego. And of course, points visiting and going in between points in between, and like New Orleans and where my family is. And at some points we were in some pretty remote areas. So I like to say that my upbringing was unique because I was in some areas where you had very Black community experience and other very remote areas where it's a very, white rural community experience. It's not very many brothers you're going to meet that said that they lived in Havre, Montana in the late 1960s, for a year.
Yeah. Okay, indeed. I don't think I've met any brothers from Montana.
See?
So tell us when did you come to California and kind of how did that come about?
Okay, yeah, the migration from both my parents happened in the 1950s, and so they're coming from Louisiana into Northern California through different routes. My mother basically is being taken out of Bogalusa, Louisiana, and you can imagine what the segregation and overt racism and white terrorism was like in Bogalusa, Louisiana in the 1950s. They're being taken out of there by my great grandmother, Bertha Wilson, and brought up to Northern California to Oroville, just for, like most folks, a better life. and basically fleeing white terrorism in Bogalusa, Louisiana. Bogalusa, Louisiana also is the birthplace of the Deacons for Defense, if anybody knows about some of that history and how virulent the Klan activity was around that area. My father, as a young man in New Orleans, he joins the Air Force in order to get himself out of, the impoverishment that comes with living in New Orleans, segregated New Orleans in the 1950s. And it allows him to travel around different spaces. This is a solution that a lot of Black men came up with at that particular time. He ended up being stationed in Northern California near the Oroville area, and that's where he met my mother. Yeah. And so in terms of me, coming to California, during the time when he was in the Air Force, we bounced back and forth to different parts of California. So after living in Florida in the late 19, well, okay, let's do this in the right order. After living in Havre, Montana in 1968, we traveled to Oroville, California, as my father did a tour in the Philippine Islands. And we stayed there in Oroville, California for a year. And from there, we went to Homestead, Florida, the southern tip of Florida, where he was stationed down there for about 3 years. And after that tour, then we were back up here in Northern California in the Sacramento area for a period of time when he did a tour of Vietnam and basically survived a tour of Vietnam. And so, yeah, we were in San Diego also after the tour he did in Vietnam. So in 1972, 1972, we were in Sacramento, and then 1973, 74, and 75, we were in San Diego. That's how I came out to California during those times.
So you guys around a lot. Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he finally decides to retire here in the Sacramento area, which is where I'm living now. And so I went to 2 years of high school in San Diego, in a very white high school.
Yeah.
I'll tell you how much of a trip this is. The high school that I went to in San Diego for 2 years is Santana High. And you'll recall that a number of years ago, I forget which one it was, that was one of the earliest high school shootings, not during the time I was there, but afterwards, they had some high school shooting there. So it was a very, white high school there. And then I came here to Sacramento and was at Johnson High School, which was more of a, Black environment. And immediately after high school, I moved to Oakland, California in 1979. Yeah. And I lived in Oakland, California from 1979 till 2019. And I mean, it's like 40 years almost to the exact month that I was there,
So how was that transition from San Diego to Sacramento at that time? What was that like?
Oh, it was difficult for me, man, to be honest with you, in many different ways, because number one, what led partly to the transition is the passing of my mom. We were going back and forth taking care of her, and she had, passed away. And so we decided to take over this home here that she has here in Sacramento. But the difficult for me is that most of my adulthood was spent and my development, my real super coming of age 2.0 was in Oakland, and in super Black Oakland from 79 on up. This pre-gentrification Oakland, which if people have been around Oakland during that period of time, when I got to Oakland in 1979, the Black Panther Party was still an organization, an official organization. And I graduated my undergrad in 1982. And I believe that was the same year that the Panther Party officially stopped being.
Oh,
but
wow. Okay.
Yeah, so when I land there, there are still a lot of people there that are active in a Black arts movement and Pan-Africanist ideologies and stuff that I'm being exposed to. None of which they're teaching in the classroom. And I went to an art school, which is another thing. If you can imagine being a Black student at an art school in the early 1980s, this is like the genesis of the culture wars at that particular time.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
Now,
you know.
which school were you at, and how did they receive all this influence you were getting, which I'm sure was coming out in your work? How did that
Mhm.
play out? So, which school were you at, and how did that play out there for you?
I was at the California College of what they called at that time the California College of Arts and Crafts. It's now called the California College of the Arts, and it's centered in San Francisco. The campus that I was at was in Oakland, and it's an over 100-year-old campus. It had a pretty good reputation at that particular time. There were a lot of students coming in from abroad, like from Japan and I had friends I was on the student council, and there were dudes there from Yugoslavia and from Turkey, and a couple of Nigerian brothers that I had met when I was on campus. So yeah, then how did they receive us? The Black students clearly were a conundrum for that campus at that particular time because their curriculums, et cetera, and so forth were still very, very Eurocentric, very white. It's what we call now a PWI, predominantly white institution, and we're precocious young men, right? I'm discovering Pan-Africanism. The first time I'd never heard the name Marcus Garvey until I get to college, and it's not in a classroom. I'm just going out exploring, getting information and stuff like that. And so, one's first reaction to that is kind of rage that certain informations and bodies of knowledge can be hidden from you so thoroughly. And so, in the classrooms, I am, asking hard questions as to why certain people aren't present in the curriculum, certain names aren't present in the curriculum, stuff like that, and
So you remember that blank look they give you when you when you
oh
think.
yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. And
Mhm.
I'm thinking back on it as recently I thought back on it. It was kind of funny. My running partner at that time was this brother named Chris from Philly, and he was a DJ and everything, right? So and he was in he was in a class with me. He used to call me my government name is Dwayne Detterville, and he brothers to shorten your name. He used to call me D-ville, right? He said
Okay, okay,
he
that's
said,
right.
man, I heard you up in that classroom today. They gonna kick your ass out of here. That's what they said.
That's right. That's right.
They gonna kick D-ville out of here. And I said, no, man, I'm gonna get all the way through it. And so what I noticed happening at that particular college was that there were some Black students coming through there, and
Mhm.
that but none of them were graduating. Like I,
Oh,
I was
okay.
continually hearing this story about people running out of funding and not having enough units to do X, Y, and Z, that kind of thing. And so my strategy at a young age was to get information from two different sources. So, one counselor here, and then I just go and ask some other people. And I was lucky enough to have as a mentor slash Jegna at that particular time, the brother that founded the ethnic studies department. His name was Michael Wright, and this cat was a SNCC organizer and, former SNCC organizer and, very erudite brother. And he made me the unofficial he made me the secretary of of the ethnic studies department. I'm sorry, at the California College of Arts and Crafts. And so he kind of pulled me under his wing and said, "Hey, take a look at some of the machinations that are going on here. I'm going to be moving on in a year or so from this position, and watch how they try to dismantle this ethnic studies department." And so
Wow.
I would, in other words, I had a type of mentoring at that time, a
Mhm.
older brother who kind of would guide me
Yeah.
in asking the right questions. And so I graduated. And the day that I went into the registrar's office or whatever to make sure that my transcripts were correct and everything, the dean came out of his office and looked at my stuff and said, "Oh, you're graduated?" Like they were surprised.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah,
you
and
you slipped through.
exactly. You know what? And at the time, man, when you're young, I'm 22 years old at that particular time. When you're young, stuff kind of like slips over you, but you don't understand the significance of it
Right.
until years later.
Yeah.
And
You
so
weren't
that
supposed to make it through. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah,
That's what
yeah,
I tell a lot of people that about, Black scholars who are teaching on university campuses. A lot of the time, even now, campuses will treat you like an alien because technically you're not expected to be there. You know what I mean?
right.
It's a real kind of
Yeah.
subtle kind of, thing. But anyway, so
Mhm,
so you're about 21, 22 years old at this point.
mhm.
What happens then? both in terms of your education, but as well as this, as I understand it, you're developing this activism at this time. So this is where are we at about now? Early 1980s?
Yes, this is the early 1980s. We're talking about a period of time between like 79 and 84. I did my undergrad between 79 and 82, graduated in 82. During the time when I'm in college, my friend and I, the brother that I mentioned to you, his girlfriend went to Mills College, and there was a Black women's collective over there. And so we were over there basically for two reasons. One, beautiful Black women, beautiful Black girls over on the campus. And two, they did political activism. Hey, we're
You
I'm
know what?
being
I
I'm
was
being
gonna ask
honest.
you if you was gonna be honest about that.
Hey, yeah, I'm gonna be honest about it.
I'm
Yeah.
a young single brother. It is what it
Yeah,
is.
it is what it is. Yeah. And so I found the other day, and not long ago, the flyers that I did for the campus event, because we were raising consciousness surrounding what was happening at that time was the Atlanta child murders. And so I designed a flyer, and they had me do a pen and ink drawing of a young boy, and they eventually used that on T-shirts, and we did a march around Lake Merritt and towards Berkeley to raise consciousness in regards to that. So that's one of the earliest things that I remember that was an actual activist event or thing that we organized where we worked with them. And my buddy, he was the DJ that would DJ their parties in order to raise money for doing these types of things for the Black Women's Collective. So I'm tossing that in there. You could probably hear it for a couple of reasons. One is, brothers, were willing to work with sisters in their organization and do tasks and things like that and work along with them in terms of political organization, because part of the false narrative that's given these days is that we don't, work with sisters or, are always trying to assume leadership, et cetera, and so forth. And that wasn't the case in that particular instance that I remember from my narrative. Yeah.
How important was that environment in the Bay coming out of the 70s? How important was that as you were going through the 80s? How much did it influence you, or was it a completely different ethos by the time you get to the 80s? Talk a little bit about that.
I'm going to say that the remnants from that was still in existence. That was the good thing about me getting there when I did, because I believe that moving into the mid 80s and late 80s, that's when it began to dissipate. But right when I got there, that 79 to 82, the early 80s, that was the last gasp, I think, of Black Arts movement. And so I was going out to, I didn't know I was in East West or where I was, but I went up to places out in East Oakland where there were some of these small venues where I'd hear people doing poetry. Marvin X was out there, and Gassim Batamuntu, the saxophonist, would be out there. And, I'm seeing, I went to, wow, I'm really the way these connections have come together, you'll see in just a minute. One class that I took when I was an undergrad was a photography class, and I wanted to do photography at a jazz concert or a jazz venue. So I found this small club on San Pablo Avenue in it's like the Berkeley Oakland borderline, right? Called the Scarab. And I went in there and I took some low light pictures in there. Eddie Henderson was playing, who was the trumpet player for Herbie Hancock, and Hadley Callman, the saxophonist that ended up on a lot of different recordings with people like Santana and Azteca and his own recordings. These are, pretty well-known figures, in the 70s jazz scene. And so I could just go into this little small club and shoot these pictures of them, and different folks would walk in, et cetera, and so forth. And so that was a certain milieu that happened that was still going on, because those musicians were still around, living in the Bay Area and still doing, regular gigs. So that 70s scene was still, that Black arts movement scene was still kind of happening at that time, and it would kind of wane and dissipate as the 80s went on, and some of the styles and things went from 70s social consciousness music more along then into Prince, Grace Jones, and stuff like that. Whereas the other social consciousness stuff was then embedded in reggae and Afrobeat. Like I discovered Fela during that time,
Okay.
I
Okay.
discovered Lytton Kwesi Johnson, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, all that kind of stuff at that particular time. So yeah, that was very important in forming my political and cultural identity
Mhm.
at that particular time. And that little club called the Scarab, years later, decades later, in the 90s, I picked up a novel by the brilliant novelist Nathaniel Mackey, who's another one of my kind of artistic and writing inspirations. And I'm reading through this novel, and he mentions the Scarab.
Okay.
So
Okay.
so during that short period of time, because the Scarab was gone by the 82, 83 or something like that, he
Yeah.
was up in there too during that
No,
period of time.
and,
Yeah.
and that's and that's incredibly important because I think we often underestimate how important institutions like that,
Mhm.
places like that are for our development. And when you
Yeah.
start to see those places disappear,
Right.
often we don't think about what's the impact on the next generation.
Right.
What extent are they going to be enlivened by something like that? And when it's gone, what does that actually mean? So
Yeah,
I
exactly.
appreciate you kind of
Yeah.
going through that.
Yeah.
uh, Mid 80s toward the end of the 80s, what took hold in your life more? Was it more education? Was it more activism? Because the last real large scale black movement I remembered from the 80s was South Africa, right?
Hmm.
Was
Yeah.
that the case for you, or what did you experience around that time?
Yeah, it was the anti-apartheid. You hit the nail on the head. The anti-apartheid movement, and going up to Berkeley. We'd done protest demonstrations up there in what we call Biko Plaza at that particular time, up in the on the UC Berkeley campus. Uh, at the time, it was really inspiring to me. It was the way that one comes to a realization that there's a global African presence, that kind of thing. And so, prior to that, I just had little inklings of it in literature and things that I had read. But it's different to be standing in a crowd where you might run into people from South Africa, or you're talking to people who are from Nigeria and these other parts of the world. That's what fascinated me about the Bay Area. And the Bay Area is very small. I had a friend at the time, he's from Newark. He used to say, man, the Bay Area is basically 3 blocks long. And he called the 3 blocks Richmond, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco. And for me, it really felt like that because you could hop on a BART or public transportation for little or nothing and be someplace else in 20, 25 minutes.
Yeah.
And for me as a young man, that was magic. that was
No, that's
that
and
was
that's
straight
real.
magic. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I was more in San Jose, Sunnyvale, and I would have
Hmm.
to drive up to Oakland to get that.
Hmm.
So
Mm,
and like especially if I wanted to go to bookstores like Marcus, I had to go up through Oakland or San Francisco to kind of get that. But you're
yeah.
absolutely right.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
And you mentioned Marcus Books. That was another revelation to me. Landing there in Oakland, I think probably it was around 80 or 81, where I literally stumbled over Marcus Books because I used to just get off the bus or get off certain places and just start walking just to see. And I walked into Marcus Books. I met Julian Richardson, who was extremely gracious elder brother. You know, along the way, each time telling these stories, Brother Hassan, I want you to hear that there's an elder brother, an older brother than me, that's being very gracious, informative, and before even knowing my name, is helping me along the way and telling me about stuff. And so he could see that I was just completely amazed by this bookstore filled with all these books on Black folks, on Black history and culture, and he helped to nurture it along. He pointed me towards stuff that I wanted to know, things
right.
that I wanted to get, all of that good stuff. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah.
So, okay. So, professionally, as we
Mhm.
close out of the 1980s, we transition into 89, 90. Where are you, and where are you in terms of your educational work and your activism? What's starting to transition for you as you move into the 90s?
Okay. Mid 80s, or after I get out of undergraduate in college, I am basically doing freelance work for various companies, like a tech company I remember out in Emeryville. And one of the freelance graphics and illustration works that I did was for Pacific Bell. At that time, the telephone company was called Pacific Bell. and then Pacific Bell hired me on in their graphics and illustration department. And basically, what that was it was doing illustrations and graphics for training manuals, et cetera, and so forth. Those types of things. In terms of my activism and other cultural development, in the mid 1980s, I discovered Capoeira. And so in 1987, I'm training this Capoeira and being around some folks in AAPRP, although I wasn't a member of the AAPRP, All African People's Revolutionary Party. And having discovered Capoeira, I'm discovering this African Brazilian presence and Portuguese and African religions and those types of things. So that this African diasporic thing begins to take over my consciousness and understanding of the world. My first trip to Brazil was in 1988. So we're down there. Yeah. I was down there for 3 weeks training Capoeira in Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, and Bahia, Salvador, Bahia. So all of that stuff is a revelation to me. And I'm also down there at one of the earliest, conferences that they held in Brazil on Capoeira too, in a place called Sergipe. Okay. And so there's, a bunch of different other folks coming to Sergipe to talk to these folks about Capoeira. And at that particular time, Capoeira had not expanded in the way that it is now. It's not all over the place.
Right.
Basically 2 places outside of Brazil, in New York and in the Bay Area. And my teacher was the second person to be teaching it in the United States, pretty much officially. Although there are other smaller narratives, I think. I'm going to say maybe he was the second mestre to teach in the United States. But there aren't that very many people. If you said Capoeira, 9 out of 10 people wouldn't know what you're talking about at that particular time.
Well, that's why I was surprised, because I never knew that they were that Capoeira was in the Bay. I'd heard about it in New York, obviously in relation to breaking, but I didn't even know what was going on in the Bay at that time.
Bira got to the Bay Area in actually the early 80s. Yeah, in the early 80s, I believe it was. Might have been even a little earlier than that. Might have been like 79 or something like that. But here's the important thing, is that his original nucleus of students were Black men with martial arts experience in East Oakland.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's a part of the history that should be told with that, because now, of course, there's the way everything gets gentrified, and there's a certain way that things develop. And what happened is there's an influx of a lot of white women who had experience in dance and folkloric dance and things of that nature, and they became the audience post mid 80s and stuff like that. So that's where that influx comes in. But it's very important that people realize that the original folks that were involved with that and helped develop it were basically Black men, and that stuff gets swept under the rug a lot. There was a martial arts studio in East Oakland it's called the Costco's. It was led by Sifu Bill Owens. And Bill Owens deserves to have his name, out there too, because that's where Bira was teaching.
Okay. Now you've raised a whole different area I might have to delve into in terms of that Black martial arts tradition, because it's extensive. I studied Sanukus Rue with some of the brothers that have been doing that work, and we're doing that in the Nation of Islam. And there's a whole history that most people don't know about. But if I'm not mistaken, in the Bay, Bruce Lee was teaching out of there early on, and brothers were working with him. Isn't that the case as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I understand. Yeah, that's what I understand, is that Bruce Lee's first official school was actually in Oakland. And people, I don't know. This is an unpopular position to take, because everybody, and I love Bruce Lee too. Like, who doesn't love Bruce Lee, right? But one of the things that I brought into the conversations, and you can imagine how this went over like a lead Zeppelin, when I was a program manager for a martial arts studio where I taught Capoeira for a while. When I'd have conversations with these different dudes, and I would say that Bruce Lee ended up teaching his martial arts and some of these cultural mores that he had learned, being who he was, of course, to this whole other audience of Black folks, white folks, et cetera, and so forth. And this is a young dude. And I could see how the elders would look at him and say, "Hey, kid, who gave you permission to do this?" I'm just saying.
Right.
And you can see to this day, people know this is a factoid that a lot of people know that Bruce Lee's first school was in Oakland, but you
Oh,
don't see
right.
you don't see air plaque,
Mm,
statue, nothing.
mhm,
you know.
mhm.
So
Absolutely.
people
Absolutely.
are. So I and yeah. Anyway.
No, and because this is a professional interview, I'm not going to get into how you, as a single man, got to Brazil and how the hell they let you leave Brazil. Most brothers like me don't want to come back, so we're gonna leave that alone for the moment.
You can't ask me
You
anything, bro. I'm good. I'm
know,
good.
so okay, so
It was a revelation.
so you were working at this point in time.
Mhm.
You said you were working for Pacific Bell and whatnot.
Yeah.
Where do you go from there? And I'm asking both about, yes, again, your education, but also some of the projects that you begin to work on. And I don't know if there's overlap there, but take me through that. What takes
Okay.
place after Pacific Bell? What's going on?
Okay. It's not exactly the way they take place after. These things overlap, and so I'll take it this way. There's my work at Pacific Bell, and after that AT&T, and my artistic practice, my fine arts practice, where I'm selling some artworks out of a Black-owned gallery called the Grand Oak Gallery, which was founded by a guy named Raymond Sanders in Oakland. There's also my capoeira practice, where I'm traveling to Brazil, like I mentioned before, and also doing demonstrations and performances with my first teacher, accordion. And so there's these things are all happening at the same time. And then another layer comes into it in the 90s, as we transition into the 90s, which is I'm hearing about people who are in rites of passage programs, brothers who are creating rites of passage programs and doing work with our youth in that way. And there's a brother named Roland Gilbert that started an organization called Simba, and Simba was the largest thing in Oakland doing work with our youth at that time. And I became a member of Simba, and my goal was to teach capoeira to the youth via Simba. I ended up teaching capoeira to the youth, but not via Simba for various reasons. And then Simba ultimately kind of went by the wayside. But Simba was a huge influence on a lot of Black adults, both men and women, and an influence on a lot of folks now who are adults now, who were the folks that we were at that time being mentors and jegnas too.
Okay. Now two kind of questions. One, make sure you explain to the audience Jegna.
Okay.
And two, how conscious were you early on at this time period that you were explicitly interested in doing work for Black males? I ask that because I tend to find that most of us have been doing some kind of work. Most of us who are interested now, who are seriously invested in dealing with Black males of any age, we look back at our lives and realize we've been doing this work in some way, shape, or form.
Sure.
How conscious were you that this work you were doing was targeted at Black males, and how much of it was just kind of organic? So start with Jet,
Hmm.
and then kind of take us through
Okay.
awareness about that.
Sure. Sure. The term now, the term jegna is used now. This is something that a word that I discovered in the mid 1990s, I would say. Um, Most people know this term mentor. And because we have an African centered ideology and perspective and worldview, what we want to do is with everything, we're trying to move a lot of these Eurocentric words that limit our understanding of things as they relate to the Black experience specifically. And nowadays, I'm a lot focused on the Black male experience specifically. And so the use of this word jegna is a Tigrinya word from Ethiopia, Tigrinya being a language and ethnic group in Ethiopia. And the word is basically a group of folks, or folks in a society that have the role of teacher and guide for younger folks oftentimes. And then the Jegana process is basically something that happens between two people. So to say that one is a Jegana means that you're facilitating this process between two people, a process of growth between two people. Um, Jegnaship is, or the term Jegna is something that, again, that I learned in the mid 1990s through a friend of mine who was already teaching Capoeira in San Diego. He's the brother that I eventually end up by the end of the 90s going to Brazil with, and we both were tested in front of the League of Capoeira in Rio de Janeiro to become given the title Contramestres. And the brother's name is Dennis Newsom. He goes by Mestre Preto Velho. And even at that time in the 90s, the name of his group was Tekura Jeganas. Tekura Jeganas. And basically this is, warrior teachers, basically is what he was doing. And it was just a way of, we're still doing this, trying to perpetually move the dial from European root language into African root languages, and even evolving it as we do here in the diaspora, even with what the meaning of those words are. So we start with the root meaning of it, and understand that we are evolving it as Africans born in the diaspora. I hope that gives some clarity. If you need more, I can
No, it
go
definitely
down a little deep.
It definitely does. And I think it also, based on how you broke it down, it leads into the other question about how aware of this, how aware of this work you were interested in doing with Black males were you throughout this time period? You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Because I think Jegna seems to be central to that. Talk a
yeah.
little bit about that.
You know, uh, being in Oakland, of course, we were surrounded by a lot of conscious Black folks doing work. There were African-centered schools, in the Bay Area, and that's the first time I'd ever had any firsthand inkling of those types of things happening. Of course, those are all products of the Black Panther Party's work doing the freedom schools, right? That kind of stuff. And so there are teachers and folks thinking along those lines. Bay Area, especially Berkeley and Oakland, are famous for having a consciousness surrounding the need for Black studies. That's where the genesis of the thing comes from ultimately. And so being around these kind of people and having conversations with them, that sparked my interest as to what is it that I'm going to be doing with the consciousness that I get. How can I reinvest it in my community for liberation in some ways? And so, as I train capoeira, I'm thinking, oh, and this may be the way that I can bring some of these ideas to the audience that I want to bring them to. And so, I'm trying to see if I'm staying on track with your question, which is, yeah, just
Yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
how aware were you? You know what I mean?
mhm,
Because again, even my own life,
yeah,
most of my research is fixated on Black men, and I
hmm,
can tell you, in the last decade when that became more focused, but I
mm,
can go back 20, 30 years and see things that I was doing early on
I
that
hear you.
we're on a clear path to what I'm doing now. But if you would have asked me then, I never would have said, "Oh, yes, this is about lifting." You know what I mean? It developed very organically, and I'm just trying
Hmm,
to assess at this point in time. I think we're really like mid '90s in your life.
hmm,
How
hmm,
aware, because when you start talking about capoeira, when you start talking about martial arts in general, there's a connection there,
yeah,
between Black men and younger Black men and boys that is
absolutely.
very implicit. It's very direct, but
Yes,
most of the time you don't hear people talk about mentorship in regard to martial arts. They just think of it as, oh, you're just teaching people how to fight. And that's kind of
right.
the extent of how they do it. So I guess what I'm asking you is how
Mhm.
conscious were you of what you were doing in regard to Black men and boys? And
Yeah.
and where did that evolve to, especially as you transition into Africana studies? So kind of tell us
Uh,
about
it, it was, I was very conscious of it. It made me conscious of so many things on so many levels that I wasn't able to actually sum total a lot of them, and I'm still trying to sum total a lot of them to this day at 61 years of age. So I'll explain some of the different milieus that I'm in because of capoeira. So at one point, I'm in a classroom situation where there's also there's a nucleus of Black men that are training it, but there's also a lot of white folks that are coming into this thing, and their particular attitudes, anxieties, et cetera, and so forth in regards to this very African practice where things get characterized as being Brazilian, before they're characterized as being, African or Black, because it makes folks uncomfortable in regards to its origins in liberation struggle and all those types of things. So that's one milieu that I'm in. And then there's the discourse with some of these brothers outside of Capoeira, where I'm saying to myself, how can we use this thing in a particular way? And so, then there was a period of time where it's actually kind of a radical move for that particular time. But there are a group of us that formed the African American Capoeira Association, which, as far as I know, is the first Black uh, association formed outside of Brazil, specifically about capoeira. It met in East Oakland in the year 1988, and it lasted just for a few years or so. But it was something that kind of shot something across the bow of a lot of white Brazilian teachers who were teaching in the United States at that particular time. And so there's that milieu where, as I go along each particular time, I'm understanding in each social gathering, I'm understanding the political significance and the potential of this particular art form, because with capoeira, you have literally everything at your disposal: music, a language that has African Yoruba words and Mandinka words in them, and Kikongo words and things of that nature in it. The whole notion of the diaspora and how this thing originates in Brazil, and that there's a populace that is the largest, Black populace outside of Africa in Brazil, and that they're speaking Portuguese, not English, not Spanish, that kind of stuff. All those types of things open the world up like a flower. It's just, and it's continually blooming. The deeper you dig into it, and the longer you practice it. And when I first started into the thing, I was starting into it for, hey, I said to myself, I'm gonna, do this for maybe a year or two, make sure I keep my body in shape, et cetera, and so forth. And I, woke up 17 years later, teaching and being in, various rites of passages in Brazil, and candomblé houses and stuff like that. So nice. I tell people that both the ancestors and the Horda, which is the circle that we play capoeira in, had its own ideas of what it was going to do with me at that particular time. So, and that needed to be played out. So all of the potential and all of the politics surrounding capoeira, I was very, very aware of and frustrated by to a certain degree, because there's, as much as there were people aware of how it is we can get this to our youth, and us having various little victories along the way and battles along the way, there's also a whole other force that wants to stop that from happening, stop us from characterizing it as an African art form, an African diasporic art form. You see what I'm saying? Because they understand too that if we're successful in getting this to our youth, man, you hand our youth instruments or take instruments away from anything, they're going to excel. They, that style, that awakening, African ethos in us is going to produce jazz. It's going to produce it's going to produce hip hop. And I had students that had, oftentimes, here's another thing, if we're saying, what we're aware of, Brother Hassan, in some of my classes in East Oakland, West Oakland, and I still have some of the attendance sheets, I had over 100 students. And in some of these classes, there were young dudes, and you've probably seen this before. We all been in school for, 12, 13 years old, and physically they can do anything.
Yeah.
They can do anything to a certain degree. I had dudes that were too talented because they they're cocky, because they can pick up anything just like this, right? Like, I got it. Or I know it. I know all that. I know all that. And for them, they can. So it's this perpetual game you have to play with them, of keep trying to raise the bar to challenge them to do things that they can't do, right? And it's kind of funny, but it also makes you realize something about them, that they have all that talent, all that potential, and it can be too much, to the point where it may come too easy, and they can get bored with something and move on. Like, I want to rap now. I'm rapping. I'm doing it. That. So that kind of stuff. So, yeah. So
that would be the point where my jiu-jitsu professor would would do a demonstration to show you how much you have yet to learn.
I hear you. I hear
Some
you.
demonstrations stuck with us for a while after that.
I hear you. I
But
hear you.
but please continue. I interrupted
Yeah,
you.
yeah. No. There's that, and the various points along the way. I ended up being the program manager and the head of the Capoeira program at a martial arts studio in Oakland called Pitt's Martial Arts Academy, and it was there that I basically broke away from the first teacher that I had and went with another teacher from that I had met in Brazil in 1988. This guy named Mestre Toro, who was basically had street cred in Rio de Janeiro like nobody's business. Still does to this day. They just put up a bronze statue of him and his brother in this place called Peña. Serious business. Like this year, they just put up a bronze statue of his brothers passed away, Denchino, but Toro's still alive, and they put up this statue of him. So I went with him, and he walks into the studio one day because the guy that owned the studio had been training with him. And he looks at me teaching the class, and he says, if you learn this list of movements and styles, I can test you and see whether you can pass the test to become a contramestre. It's a written, oral, and physical test. You'll have to come to Brazil and do this in front of a few hundred Brazilians and a panel of mestres. And so myself, the brother that owned the studio, and my other brother, Dennis Newsom from San Diego, the three of us went down there and we did this test. The reason I'm saying this is because, again, like I told you, there's these various revelations that happen to you. And as I was down there in 1999 when I was doing this, after I had passed the test and I'm wearing this cord around my waist that they had put on me, and they've done this rite of passage for me to pass this test. I went into the bathroom. I just had to be quiet, for a moment, because I couldn't believe that what the arc had been from me just, being curious about something early on in the mid 1980s and ending up in this place with all these different people. And it's carried me through to a lot of different things. I ended up, going back there in the mid around 2009, 2010, and I interviewed the legendary scholar Abdias de Nascimento. So I'm meeting him, talking to him, and part of his, some of the interview and the information that I got is what led to some of the information that I wrote about in my master's thesis on visual culture. So yeah, the way things can be carried along for you, and so learning those things, it snowballs, and I'll go back if you want me to fill in some details, but I'm saying that part to say that by the time I start teaching in juvenile corrections, which was maybe a handful of years ago, all of that information that I have, as being a visual culture scholar and doing these curriculums and being able to turn this into like a political education class where I'm talking about the global presence of African people, all of that experience is what culminates in me doing a lesson where it may ostensibly look like we're doing a thing about comic book heroes and things like that, but in reality, we end up, they created their own comic book heroes and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Well, look, take us through the master's degree. Take us through that a little bit, and how you were able to kind of bring in these other, experiences that you're having around that time. So take us through that. Where did you go, and what did you decide to do?
Okay, so I'm going to reel it back a little bit. In the late 1990s, I met my wife while I was teaching capoeira at the studio that I mentioned to you, and fell in love with her, and we both started talking. She not so ironically knew she came from San Diego and had met Dennis Newsom, my brother in capoeira, down there, and was curious. She saw a sign up in the window, said somebody teaches capoeira up there, and came up the steps, and that's how we met. But in developing our relationship and talking to each other, we decided that we wanted to form an organization. Sankofa Cultural Center is what we were calling it at that particular time. And that's how I began as a capoeira teacher in East and West Oakland on my own via the organization Sankofa Cultural Center, which is a nonprofit that we put together. And as an independent contractor, I started teaching capoeira. And so uh, because of that desire to do it as a rite of passage program, I'm teaching it in a particular way where there's binders. I'm teaching a broad range of students, ages from or as early as preschool on up to adults down at the studio. And so so yeah, I'm I'm teaching capoeira, and then I transitioned from capoeira to doing these things where I bring in my other interest, which has to do with jazz and the jazz aesthetic. And she understood that I had this passion for it and had developed a knowledge base surrounding it. And she says, why don't you incorporate this into what we're doing with Sankofa Cultural Center? And so in the loft space that we had in then in East Oakland, we invited a whole panel of various scholars, both official scholars and unofficial scholars, like folks that were basically vernacular scholars of the music, into our loft. And we did our first symposium, which was Jazz, the Black Aesthetic. Now, there was also another inspiration, if you will, for Jazz, the Black Aesthetic, which was that the San Francisco Jazz Festival had held a panel discussion on jazz and race. And I was unhappy with who was on the panel discussion and what they were talking about in regards to jazz and race, because they had left out a full notion of it being an African diasporic art form, something born of some aesthetics that come from the continent and are infused into the Black experience here in the Americas. And so our panel was an anecdote, if you will, to that panel.
Okay.
In the same way that Charles Mingus and Max Roach did their kind of outside of Newport Jazz Festival concert outside of the Newport Jazz Festival. So that was how that evolved into that. And we ended up doing 3: Jazz, the Black Aesthetic, jazz, Bird Bop, Black Art and Beyond, talking about the Black experience and Black artists in the 1950s, which inspired mainly by a brother named Arthur Monroe that I had met, who is another elder who's was a Jegna to me. May he rest with the honored ancestors. This brother knew Charlie Parker as a teenager.
Wow.
And and was a painter and had some rare film of him that had never been seen in the United States, which we also showed at another independent Black cultural center in East Oakland, run by another elder brother who let us use his space. And the third one was called the Sacred Jazz Symposium, and that one had the John Coltrane Church from San Francisco, and the Reverend Bishop Franzo King from the John Coltrane Church and the John Coltrane Band, and the legendary E.W. Wainwright on drums leading the band at that particular time, and a whole panel. I'm skipping over a lot of different names and panelists, but there's a bunch of people that showed up there. Prince Lachey showed up there to that particular one. We got written up in the San Francisco Chronicle that year for that symposium that we did. And so that's how things started to evolve in terms of what we were doing in terms of cultural activism. The capoeira stuff I was teaching at the same time, and then also this other thing with jazz.
Well, I'm curious how this kind of works its way into your academic life, master's degree, and then teaching. But before you get to that, there's another aspect of this jazz experience that I want you to expound upon that's a little more personal in terms of the relationship with your father. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Thank you, man. Thank you for that question, because that's very important. Albert Raymond Detterville is probably the most influential person on my notion and understanding of Black masculinity. And one of the ways in which I came to understand it as a kind of an essence or ethos, so to speak, beyond a lot of the intellectual things that surround it, is just having this experience of hearing my father play and when I was very young, him being around other GIs who played vinyl records, vinyl jazz records, people like, Oliver Nelson, Jimmy Smith, Kenny Burrell, and Cannonball Adderley, that kind of stuff, and how they interacted with each other as these records were playing. And so that interaction, that kind of essence, and the Black men socializing with each other in this particular way was a heavy influence on me and my whole stylization and understanding of what it is to be a Black man in this society. And so in honor of that, so to speak, that's where the inspiration partly for the symposiums come from, is that passion was built up in me at an early age before I had any words for it. And it finally culminated in me doing these symposiums. And so I most times I invoke his name and tell people that he was the inspiration for that. And so it's been many years since we've done one. The Sacred Jazz Symposium was the last one we did. And so this next thing that we're doing, this forthcoming, is a jazz mbongi that will have to do with specifically focus on this topic of jazz and Black masculinity. Yeah. And so where we're going to deepen the discussion in regards to the specificity of what the phenomenon that I just mentioned.
Okay.
And so I'm going to get to academics, which is, in terms of my graduate studies, there were friends of mine still. I have a certain social circle of folks that I would talk to about art and music, of course. And a friend of mine was going to CCA, California College of the Arts, in graduate studies in visual. I think they called it I think they just called it visual studies at that particular time, or visual studies at that time. And he says, "Man, you should look into this, because this is the type of thing these are the things that you're talking about." He came over to my house and looked at my bookshelf, and he said, "Hey, man, you got basically the same books on yourself that I got on my shelf. You need to go here and check this out." And so I went to one of the symposiums and talked to the then head of the department, and she said, "Yeah, we would like to get you up here." And so I, filled out the application, sent in my, letters of recommendation, all those things, and they basically gave me a full scholarship to the program. And I went through the program, and eventually they gave me the alumni award, which was a great honor. I was glad that they recognized me in that particular way, and it was one of the best experiences I ever had. It was a tipping point for me in basically studying philosophy and critical theory and things of that nature. It was an intensive in that regard. My focus was on African and African diasporic visual culture and visual studies, and so I would have to go outside of what was commonly given to me inside the institution and pull other informations in. And so, to answer your question, all these other things, this experience that I had of African religions in Brazil, and matter of fact, I had by that time gone to Haiti as well. All those things, and my artistic practice as well, all those things led up to me having a background and a certain knowledge that I could already bring into the program, where I wouldn't be sidetracked by what at that time was most popular is, French post-structuralist philosophy, and not a lot of things that focused on African diaspora studies, like, J. Laurent Mattori or Robert Ferris Thompson, et cetera, Donald Cosentino, things like that. So, yeah.
Okay. Tell us, and this is a little different type of question, but in the midst of all of these different things you're doing, what kept you focused on the type of work you want to do? What was the driving force that kind of kept you? I mean, because you have all of these things revolving around you, and you're applying them in a very specific way that's about communal uplift. But what kept you focused? What kept you from, just kind of checking out? Like, what was it that kept you on track going through all of that?
Oh, a passion for African and African diasporic things and aesthetics, because at each turn, I would learn something that, again, it was that perpetually, like I was talking about before, that perpetually blooming flower. That was the reward most of the time. And the ways in which the work became, a microcosm for what was happening in the macrocosm. Like, how does the politics surrounding the way the white status quo is approaching the politics surrounding capoeira, how does that parallel the way they act, in other parts of the world, these kind of neo-colonial attitudes, or these certain anxieties that they have surrounding Black folks with consciousness and power. All of that stuff is deeply, and still is to this day, as you can hear in my voice,
Mhm.
is deeply fascinating to me. That's really what keeps me focused, and it's just I have a passion and love for African people,
Mhm.
everywhere I go. And I think that bright-eyed look on my face is what makes them always approach me and want to give me things.
No.
Like, I mean, literally, some people, I don't know who's had any type of odd experiences with traveling abroad, but every place I've gone, people are like, hey, they taking me by my hand and showing me places, showing me things, showing me
Right.
things that folks that live there don't
Mhm.
get. I mean, and I'm not exaggerating,
Yeah.
but it's showing me things that folks that live there don't get to see.
Yeah.
I this reminded me of a story.
Mhm.
So in probably, and I have a Polaroid around here of me with him someplace. Probably it was 1980 or 81, around when, remember the Nigerian artist King Sunny Ade? He came to the United States for the first time and he played the Greek Theater in Berkeley. I had a camera. I was shooting some pictures and shooting concert pictures there. And I was standing by the barrier after the show, and I'm seeing all of these folks walking backstage, right? And of course, it's all white folks walking, backstage to see the band, get with the band, and everything, right? And I just, looking back there, and this brother over my shoulder with Nigerian accent looks at one of the cats that's in the band and said something to him in pidgin, and rubbed me on the shoulder like this. And one of the dudes from the band walks over to me, puts his arm around my shoulder, and walks me backstage. And eventually, I got introduced to King Sunny. I shot a couple of pictures of him backstage, which I still have, and so, like, that's the way stuff seems to work for me. They say there's Elegua, the opener of the way. Elegua has been my friend for a long time, man. Especially with Black folks that I meet, African folks that I meet, they open the way for me. So,
Mm.
yeah.
It, talk about the importance of travel, not only in your own experience, but what you might recommend, particularly to young brothers at that. How important was travel to your worldview and to the work you ended up you continue to do? What role did travel play in that? Because you've been to Africa, you mentioned Haiti, you mentioned Brazil, and
Mhm.
I'm not even sure how many countries in Africa. Talk
Two countries in Africa, Senegal and Ghana, two of the most beautiful trips I've ever had before in my life. My first trip to Senegal was in 2016. Went there with my good brother, the aerosol spray can painter Rifa One, and I went there as part of his organization called Aerosol Arts. And when we got there, we were working with some brothers there that created a festival called Festigraph. Festigraph in Dakar, Senegal, is a bunch of aerosol spray can artists from all across the continent, Europe, and North and South America coming there to. It's a hip hop festival, basically, mostly Black folks, and coming there basically to celebrate the power of hip hop, and also the specific inspiration is Pan-Africanism. Each year they would honor a specific Pan-Africanist. And the year that I was there, they were honoring Amilcar Cabral, but previous honorees were Sankara and Mandela and Kwame Nkrumah and Leopold Senghor and all these different people. So there was this celebration that we are a global people and a celebration of a Pan-African consciousness. And I would just say that, for me, is a revelation and inspiration because I'm older than they are. I'm like, in my late 50s at that particular time. And these are folks young enough to be my sons and daughters, ultimately with this Pan-African consciousness and this youth movement inspiration and fervor in them. And so travel has been for me, again, a revelation and a key part of that, that African flower that continues to bloom and continues to reward with all types of information and things that help me have a deeper knowledge of self, and the deeper knowledge of self as a global presence too. That with that African people, we are a global presence. And so, yeah, all of those places I traveled to and went to Ghana, to Accra and Kumasi and other parts in Ghana in the year of return, 2019, with my wife, which was another beautiful thing. This is where I got my name, Kwadwo Addo Gyan, in a village, Akua Pim, with some Akan folks from a royal family there, basically in another rite of passage, another ritual, and I was given this name along with the other beautiful folks that were on the trip with us as well. So I recommend it. I recommend it to every African born in America. Come up out of this place and go experience the continent. And experience it with some folks who have experience going there and can take you to the right places, and leave behind whatever your preconceived notions are about the continent, and also leave behind all your preconceived notions about who you are too. And when folks see that you've done that, they'll welcome you like family, like literally. It's all I got there was, welcome home, brother. Yeah, hey brother, how you doing? Welcome home, that kind of thing. So
well, and and sometimes time is of the essence. I mean, currently what's recently happened in Haiti, right, is this 7.0 earthquake, and you never know who who we might lose,
yeah.
So there's something to be said for going as soon as you can, really, to some extent.
Yes.
You never know,
Yes.
what can happen and who we might lose in the course of these natural events, wars, political issues, COVID. You never know.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree, man. I agree. Yeah.
Go ahead.
When you mentioned Haiti, the thing that came to mind for me was it's just the incredible power and resilience of those peoples to still be a people, after enduring all of those things for all these many, a little bit over 2 centuries now, man. It and when you see them, the amount of creativity and resourcefulness. When I was down there, down there with a group of artists, and what we did was we met other artists and were doing work with some other artists, and the amount of creativity and ingenuity that these people have with regular everyday materials is incredible. It's a type of genius, that they have. So one can see how they could survive, the multitude of disasters and things that both, social, cultural, and political, and the entire Western world literally waging war against them, and they still remain a nation.
Absolutely.
So that's
well. Let me change gears a bit, and I'm going to go back into the academic for a little. And really, I shouldn't even say it that way because it's going to tie into everything else, really. But one of the things that we've grappled with in Black male studies is the way gender is taught, gender studies as a formal field. What are the kind of things that you've become aware of, in terms of that? And I'm sure this question applies, in terms of academics, in terms of activism, and even in regard to travel and your work with Black males. What are you noticing about the way gender is kind of taught, and what needs to be part of the discussion, as in terms of your work? And I regard you as a Black male studies scholar. You can let me know if I you missing, but that's how I regard you. Tell me what your thoughts are about that. What are you seeing, and what should we see more of?
Wow, that's a very broad, expansive question. What I think we should see more of, and I'm very pleased that we are seeing this thing grow the way it is. And again, I've told you this personally before. You give me a chance to say it in person, man. I'm eternally grateful for cats like you and Curry and and Siri McDougal for doing the scholarship, the foundational, scholarship in regards to this field. What we need to see more of is cats like you, which is what's happening. Your work is having impact. There are ripples, from that, such that our voices now are being heard in ways that they had never been heard of before. We're being given vocabulary that we never had before, and because we're being given vocabulary that we never had before, we're able to assess our earlier lives in ways that we weren't able to do before. So, what things that had no significance to me when I was a young man now have great significance. Things that occur to me have a very profound significance to me. And so, in the type of study itself, I think that what we need to have is more closed conversation. To be honest with you, Black men need to socialize more in the cultural intimacy of Black male spaces, more so, in order to be able to feel that the type of things that they're going to express will be heard without preconceived monitoring, a preconceived editorial process. In most of these predominantly white institutions, these Eurocentric institutions, Black men are the minority in these classrooms, and I'm hearing, all kinds of different horror stories. I get calls from and talk to brothers that are in graduate studies programs and PhD programs that are, having a great deal of difficulty because, of course, as you already know, as they're sitting in these classroom spaces, they're perceived to be either just broken in some sort of way, or perceived to be a threat in some sort of way. And all of the superimposed stereotypes around Black men, aggressivity and violence, et cetera, and so forth. All those things are already superimposed on the body before they enter the room or enter the discourse. And so there's a type of editing back of one's voice that happens because of that. And they've told me, there's some willful editing back of the voice, and sometimes it's literal in the tone of voice, and otherwise not so literal in that they have to express things, not so ironically, about their own lived experience in ways that they have to do in order to make it palatable to a room that is already hostile to them, and that there's already a body of epistemology, of critical theory and philosophy that is already hostile towards the Black male body specifically. The Black male body is probably the most terrifying image in Western culture, to Western culture. Absolutely. And so these are the things that we have to wrestle with. So again, to answer your question, like what we need to see is, we need that Black room, that Black male room, where the thing that my father, was involved with a couple of Jimmy Smith records and some GIs.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying? That's what we need with intent. And kudos to you, good brother. Salute to you, good brother, because to a large degree, even though there are other forces that can monitor what's going on, what you created online in the Onyx report is very much that. In that, brothers are speaking freely to a certain degree and being able to express things in ways that we've never been able to express before.
And that's,
but we,
that's powerful, because you're definitely right. I mean, in my lifetime, I haven't seen Black men being able to speak this freely about so many different subjects. It's actually something that one has to get used to some extent, because there really hasn't been much of a platform. I mean, we see it in small spaces, like one of your projects you talked about, the barbershop. We've seen it in these little spaces, but to have it as widespread, we don't see it as often.
Right.
Changing. This is still really on that subject, but a slightly different direction. One of the things I've heard in the last 5 to 6 years at random is when people would say things like, well, Black men aren't activists. Black men are not really doing this work. What do you say when people say things like that? That activism is no longer that was back in the 50s, back in the 60s and the 70s. That's Black men aren't doing activism anymore. What do you have to say in regard to that?
Wow. The thing that the reason I chuckle at this is because, the thing that gets me about some of those statements, the term that I used to hear is that, and that Black women are doing the heavy lifting. This was during BLM and et cetera, and so forth. And it struck me as odd at a certain time that kind of emerged, when BLM uh, began as a term, as a hashtag, et cetera, and so forth, because I don't recall prior to them, like even those times in the Bay Area where there was that kind of friction or sentiment between Black men and women. It could just have been like I said before, early on with my personal narrative. My friend and I, we would go to the Black Women's Collective, and if they needed help working with something, they told us what to do. We worked with them, and nobody thought anything of it. So the reason I chuckle at it is, one, for that reason, and the second thing is that what is on these people's mind when they think about the Black male experience in America? I'm a man in my 60s now, and I survived the 80s and 90s, the pre-cell phone era of police terrorism. Like, what do you think it takes to survive doing this kind of work in America, where you could even look out and say, oh well, where are they at and what are they doing? That kind of thing. Where does the question even come from? So to a certain degree, I feel like there's the part of the public that has that question or tries to make that point or have that kind of condescension. That's an act of violence in and of itself. When we look across the board and see who the overwhelming majority of Black political prisoners are in this country, they're Black men. We look at the overwhelming majority of the assassinations that have taken place in this country, even in recent memory, where you have folks like Darren Seals in Ferguson. The overwhelming majority of these assassinations that take place have been Black men. So in terms of being in the war, we're taking some pretty stiff hits out here, and people need to look at folks who survive, the hits and certain eras, and say, yeah, you must be doing something right in order to to
Absolutely.
survive this on a couple of different levels. And oftentimes, Brother Hassan, it may not even be the type of hits that come in physically being, pulled over and beat up and things of that nature, but it's all of the psychic
Oh yeah.
war
Yeah.
waged on one on a daily
Yeah.
basis,
Oh yeah.
where
Yeah.
yeah, taking a walk is a caution,
Oh yeah.
a cautionary thing one needs to do, or coming into a store, do you keep all your receipts,
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
those types of things, things
Yeah.
that a lot of folks don't have to think about.
Sure. Sure.
uh yeah,
Sure.
so
No, I
that.
raised that. Matter of fact, I was talking about that the other day because my son is, he just turned 16.
Mhm.
He's 6'7", and
Wow.
he has long locks, and the
Wow.
most, just the happiest kid. He's a video game head. He likes to talk to his friends, but
Yeah.
upon seeing him, especially coming home from school, even especially if it's dark, what I mean, you just see this shadow of this
Yeah.
6'7", young Black male, and I
Mhm.
ponder on what other people see. See, I see my baby,
I
you know,
hear you.
but
Mhm.
but we as Black men have know that dual experience, right? We can take it back to that Du Boisian notion. I know what others see. I
Mhm.
know our experiences outside of the dominant narrative, and I
Yeah.
and I think about what can happen. And so we actually have to get to this point, especially in how we raise our sons, where we almost have to teach them how to be connected to a very warped mindset where they
Mm.
have to anticipate how other people see them doing the most innocent things, like you said, just walking down the street. That in and of itself is profound, and yet at the same time tragic, because
Yeah.
one would think in a healthy environment you don't got to worry about what other people, and you can live your life. We don't have that kind of luxury because not being aware can cost us our lives. You know what I mean? So
Absolutely.
there-
Absolutely.
there's just something just profoundly problematic about that, and yet necessary. Like,
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And maybe to go back to a previous question you asked me about travel.
mhm.
One of the reasons why I think a young man like your son and others should travel to Africa is because at a certain point, once you land there, that cinder block about of the need to be that self-aware in that way all the time is lifted off of your head. So you can take that walk through Dakar, through the streets of Dakar, and that cinder block, that hyper consciousness, about danger, is lifted off of your head. And
Wow.
so
Did that did
one
that
must.
did that take some getting used to when you first began to travel? Just the notion that I don't have to think about that. How long did that take for you to grapple to actually grasp? How did that affect?
Yeah, I believe I first experienced it really in Dakar, where I was conscious of it, and I was in it's the Medina neighborhood. Wow, I remember that. I was in this Medina, the neighborhood called Medina in Dakar. They have a thing called Cafe Tuba, which is small spicy coffee that they make out on the street, and these brothers taking it, pouring it, up in the air and doing all like that and talking, and folks around me. And as I was walking back and forth and going to get my cafe tuba, I realized, man, that I was breathing, breathing.
You said I was breathing.
Yeah, I was breathing. It was sublime. It really was, and I recommend it for everybody.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
your thoughts on the future of your work, especially as it relates to Black men and boys. What do you see your work evolving into, and what do you think Black male studies needs to kind of focus on?
Wow. Uh, for my own work, I really, really would like to bring this notion that I talked about before, this observation that I had with my father, and the notion of the jazz aesthetic, into a new generation. And so I'm hoping that this thing with the Mbongi, the jazz Mbongi, will do that. And we're working, hard in terms of knowing enough. At least that's has to do with my own sense of needing perfection in a certain thing, of knowing enough to be able to deploy that in a way where that would change folks. So the future of my own work has to do with that, and and trying to get that to the point where I can have a broad range of ages, boys and men, in a room, comfortable with listening to and discussing the power in this particular music and aesthetic and its broad history. What does Black male studies need? That's really broad. I think that it's happening. You're already doing it. You're having it an open field in social media, which is where people are living to a certain degree right now. What I want to do is I want to bring this notion of black masculinity, or the specificity of the Black male experience, to my artistic practice, and again to these discussions that come up because one has an insight into the jazz aesthetic. What happens with the jazz aesthetic is that because one is discussing sound and the ability to emote and give emotion and articulation without necessarily connecting it to speech, it takes things in a direction that opens up the what can be expressed in a different way. And so, if we're listening to Kamasi Washington or Max Roach and people like that, then the discussion of what they do and how they've done it, how they've lived their lives, and how their particular artistic expression reflects that. I think that helps. That would help young men be able to express what's going on in their day-to-day lived experience as well. And watching other men older than them be able to do the same thing in the same context, I think is going to be uh, powerful. That's something that I would like to add to the notion of Black male studies.
Okay. Look,
Yeah.
man, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule. I know the school semester is about to get started for both of us. So thank you for doing this, and also thank the Queen for letting me kidnap you for a little bit.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
best, and I want that on the record. Tell her I said hello, and
I
I've
sure will.
missed both.
I,
But no, really, I really appreciate this, and it's been incredibly informative. So thank you.
oh, thank you for thinking of me, good brother.
Oh
Yeah,
man, please.
yeah, yeah.
Um, okay, so I'm gonna pull you down and just kind of close out. So hold on. Okay, so that was Professor Kwadwo Addo Gyan, and you can check out his work at the links that you see provided on the screen. A prolific artist, scholar, writer in the Bay Area of California. I hope you've enjoyed this interview with the Institute for Black Male Studies. Make sure you support the Institute. You can go to the website and do so. You can purchase merchandise. You can consume some of the media there. Much of it is free. There are webinars on there as well as courses. And you can also recommend a course if you're interested in doing so. You can email me through the website itself. But also you can support through patreon.com. Just look up T.H. Johnson, Dr. T. Hassan Johnson on Patreon. And you can support the Institute by being a monthly contributor there alongside purchasing merchandise on the actual website itself. So thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed, and we will be seeing you soon. Peace.